not going to get as sick. And we're clearly seeing that in long-term care. As you know, we've had a little bit of an uptick in outbreaks in wave 4. Wave 3, it was pretty calm, but we're not seeing the severity of illness and fatalities that we saw in wave 1 as a proportion of those cases. So yes, it is getting much better.
Thank you. Our next caller is Mike Hager from Globe and Mail. Please go ahead.
Thanks for taking our questions. So you referenced Ontario as an analog for BC because they use the same criteria. But looking at Quebec, they had tons of deaths during the first wave, but they were unable to contain it during the second wave. They implemented stricter mask requirements, infection prevention control, and just went on a hiring blitz that summer. Why did BC do so poorly? Nearly 90% of all the deaths came in the second wave. Why did it fail in the second wave?
That is a good question. And as I say, clearly our wave 1 experience, part of that was due to our overall lower community transmission, which we did not see in wave 2. In wave 2, even though all the numbers were higher, actually the proportion was still lower. So in wave 1, 10% of our cases were in long-term care. And in wave 2, it was 5% of our cases. Now, when we look at the review and we say, okay, what could we do that would reduce those number of cases? That's where we're saying, provide more paid sick leave to your staff so that they will stay home when they are sick. Increase the presence of registered nurses on your site so that you have that leadership and clinical expertise to control that outbreak. Reduce shared rooms because people in shared rooms, if one person is positive, clearly a higher probability that the other person will also test positive. And then testing. So get in there at the beginning, test everybody, repeat test frequently. And we now have the rapid antigen test to add to the toolbox. We can't have it substitute in totality for the PCR test, but we can use them in a very complementary way. One of the big things that happened in January was the rapid antigen test was approved for use as a nasal swab only. And that is significant when you're looking at the care facility sites and the burden on staff and the expertise required to do a full nasal pharyngeal swab, which is what the PCR test requires, was, I think, frustrating the ability to fully implement the rapid antigen test. That roadblock is gone now. So they are very easy to use, and they are arguably not as sensitive as the PCR test in that they don't pick the virus up as early in the viral load. But if you are shedding a lot of virus and infectious, it is highly sensitive to picking up the disease.
Do you have a follow-up, Mike?
Always. Thank you. Sorry, so you didn't really touch on what operators told you about why they didn't staff up in between the first and second wave. But did they say anything there? And then also wondering for your second recommendation about more direct care, how can you do that in this sector, especially, for operators that are trying to make a profit? We just got an email yesterday from someone whose mom broke their tibia in an Nanaimo long-term care home. Care is not where it needs to be, and the pandemic kind of really highlighted that. You've done so in past reports. How do you expect the sector, particularly the for-profit part of the sector, to deliver those care hours?
Okay, so I'll try to answer your first question, which was about staffing up. It is a good question. I think that it's possible that when we were looking at various potential second waves, that we underestimated the degree to which it was going to overwhelm the long-term care system, particularly in the Lower Mainland. And to be fair, there was movement on the initiative to train and mobilize more staff. It can't happen overnight. So I think it was recognized that more staff were needed. You're seeing that reflected in these extraordinary levels of overtime. So you have an exhausted labor force because, yes, we didn't increase the bodies a lot, but we increased the demand on those bodies exponentially. And so we're going to have to look at how we get more bodies in, because that level of overtime is not sustainable, irrespective of the financial impacts, just the human impact. And then your next question about decreasing the contracting for direct care. A couple of things have happened there. First of all, the wage leveling. And once an operator is paying, for want of a better term, the industry standard wage levels, a lot of the benefits for contracting disappear or dissipate. And so if we maintain that wage leveling on a go-forward basis, I think we will find that over time, operators will shift to employing people directly, because there won't be the margins, if you will, to be able to pay a contractor when these industry standard wages or the wage leveling wages have to be paid. So I believe we should maintain that ongoing. I've, as you know, spoken about that frequently in the past. And I think if we do that, it's going to solve another problem as well, which is I think we will actually see a significant decrease in contracting for direct care.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Mary Griffin at Czech. Please go ahead, Mary.
Oh, hi. Thank you so much for taking my call. And just following up on
the whistleblower. Next to Facebook, and the global outage of the company's social media apps then saw a damaging testimony from a former employee on how the company chooses, she says, profit over safety. So the troubles are escalating for Facebook chief Mark Zuckerberg. The CEO has broken his silence on some of those recent allegations. He's put forth a strong defense in a note to Facebook staffers. Zuckerberg says claims made by the former employee in the United States, Frances Haugen, did not make any sense. He says the argument that Facebook deliberately pushes content that makes people angry, all for profit, is illogical. Zuckerberg also pushed back against Haugen's claim on a 2018 newsfeed change that allegedly encourages the sharing of more divisive content. He said it was done to encourage the sharing of more content between friends and family, despite Facebook knowing it would lead to decreased engagement. And Zuckerberg tried to clarify on Instagram's negative effects on teens, according to the whistleblower. He says the company will continue its research and prioritize building what is safe and good for children. On Tuesday, a Senate committee convened a public hearing with Facebook's whistleblower, Frances Haugen. The focus of that hearing was the safety of children, and broader concerns also including toxic algorithm amplification.
I'm here today because I believe Facebook's products harm children, stoke division, and weaken our democracy.
Explosive testimony from a former Facebook employee turned whistleblower. Frances Haugen, a former product manager on Facebook's civic misinformation team, told a congressional committee on Tuesday that Facebook knowingly amplifies divisive and harmful content, choosing profit over safety, and that Facebook has sought to keep its operations confidential amid mounting scrutiny, especially in regards to its effects on children.
Congressional action is needed. Today, no regulator has a menu of solutions for how to fix Facebook because Facebook didn't want them to know enough about what's causing the problems.
Lawmakers in both parties pounced.
Its only real principle is profit.
Mark Zuckerberg's going sailing and saying no apologies.
Accusing CEO and founder Mark Zuckerberg of pushing for higher profits, while being cavalier about user safety. And they demanded that regulators investigate whistleblower accusations that the social media company harms children and stokes divisions.
Our children are the ones who are victims. Teens today looking at themselves in the mirror, feel doubt and insecurity.
Yeah, welcome to fucking life.
Mark Zuckerberg ought to be looking at himself in the mirror.
In the end, the buck stops with Mark. There's no one currently holding Mark accountable by himself.
Haugen said Facebook had also done too little to prevent its site from being used by people planning violence, saying its focus on metrics trumped ethical concerns. Facebook was used by people planning mass killings in Myanmar and the January 6th assault on the U.S. Capitol by supporters of then-President Donald Trump, who was determined to toss out the 2020 election results.
Facebook can change, but is clearly not going to do so on its own. My fear is that without action, divisive and extremist behaviors we see today are only the beginning. What we saw in Myanmar and are now seeing in Ethiopia are only the opening chapters of a story so terrifying, no one wants to read the end of it.
Haugen says Facebook has the tools to de-emphasize divisive content, but chooses to use it to keep engagement high.
Facebook knows that content that elicits an extreme reaction from you is more likely to get a click, a comment, or reshare.
A Facebook spokeswoman disputed Haugen's knowledge of the company's inner workings, adding, quote, "We don't agree with her characterization of the many issues she testified about." The Senate hearing reflects the rising anger in Congress with Facebook amid numerous demands for legislative reforms, with senators warning that Facebook faces a reckoning akin to other industries like big tobacco.
Yeah, okay. We'll see about that.
This is James Brower. He lives in British Columbia.
No one cares.
This is the Peter Pan story, roughly speaking. Peter Pan is this magical boy. Pan is the god of everything, roughly speaking, right? And so it's not an accident that he has the name Pan. And he's the boy that won't grow up. And he's magical. Well, that's because children are magical. They can be anything. They're nothing but potential. And Peter Pan doesn't want to give that up. Why? Well, he's got some adults around him, but the main adult is Captain Hook. Well, who the hell wants to grow up to be Captain Hook? First of all, you've got a hook. Second, you're a tyrant. And third, you're chased by the dragon of chaos with a clock in its stomach, right? The crocodile. It's already got a piece of you. Well, that's what happens when you get older. Time has already got a piece of you. And eventually, it's got a taste for you. And eventually, it's going to eat you. And so Hook is so traumatized by that he can't help but be a tyrant. And then Peter Pan looks at traumatized Hook and says, well, no, I'm not sacrificing my childhood for that. So that's fine, except he ends up king of the Lost Boys. In Neverland, well, Neverland doesn't exist, and who the hell wants to be king of the Lost Boys? And he also sacrifices the possibility to have a real relationship with a woman, because that's Wendy, right? And she's kind of conservative, middle-class, London-dwelling girl. She wants to grow up and have kids and have a life. She accepts her mortality. She accepts her maturity. Peter Pan has to content himself with Tinkerbell.
What?
She doesn't even exist. She's like the fairy of porn. She doesn't exist. She's the substitute for the real thing. And so, but the dichotomy that you're talking about is very tricky because there's a sacrificial element in maturation, right? You have to sacrifice the pluripotentiality of childhood for the actuality of a frame. And the question is, well, why would you do that? Well, one reason is it happens to you whether you do it or not. You can either choose your damn limitation, or you can let it take you unaware when you're 30, or even worse, when you're 40. And then that is not a happy day. I see people like this, and I think it's more and more common in our culture because people can put off maturity without suffering an immediate penalty. But all that happens is the penalty accrues. And then when it finally hits, it just wallops you. Because when you're 25, you can be an idiot. It's no problem. Even when you're out in a job search, it's like, well, you don't have any experience and you're kind of clueless. It's, yeah, you're young. It's no problem. Young people are like, but they're full of potential. Okay, well, now you're the same person at 30. It's like people aren't so thrilled about you at that point. It's like, what the hell have you been doing for the last 10 years? Well, I'm just as clueless as I was when I was 22. It's, yeah, but you're not 22. You're an old infant, right? And that's an ugly thing, an old infant. So Part of the reason you choose your damn sacrifice, because the sacrifice is inevitable, but at least you get to choose it. And then there's something that's even more complex than that in some sense, is that the problem with being a child is that all you are is potential, and it's really low resolution. You could be anything, but you're not anything. I think university's facilitated because you can go to university to not be something instead of going to university to be something. And it's Pleasure Island. Huh. And the price you pay for it, especially in the US, is debt. And you're enticed into it because the administrators can pick your pocket. So they rob your future self while allowing you to pretend that you have an identity, right? Very nasty. And you can't declare bankruptcy with your student loans in the US. It's indentured servitude. And it's precisely Pleasure Island. It's exactly that. And so tuition fees have shot way out of control. And part of the reason that universities don't make more demands on their students and let them get away with things they let them get away with is because they're basically, why the hell would you chase them out? They're $100,000 or more. So they can do whatever they want as long as you get to sell them to the salt mines. So then you go and you adopt an apprenticeship, roughly speaking. And then you become something. And when you're something, that makes the world open up to you again. I see that in resentful men all the time. They're very antipathetic towards women, and they blame their misery and resentment on the fact that women won't have anything to do with them, while the women are making them self-conscious for not being all they should be. Because the women think, why should I bother with you if you're not the embodiment of the spirit that will move into the unknown and face the Leviathan, which is exactly what she should be saying. And you're thinking, well, I don't want to have anything to do with that, but I'd like women to like me anyways. It's like, well, good luck with that. So that doesn't work out, right? And that's exactly what happens when God finds out that Adam and Eve have become self-conscious. One of the first things he says is, jig's up now, man. You're going to be working forever, toiling forever. It's your destiny. There's no escaping from it. Well, human beings work. What does that mean? They sacrifice the present for the future. And that's partly, as soon as this happens, like the next story, which is Cain and Abel, you see the motif of sacrifice emerge, right? That story circulates around the motif of sacrifice. Sacrifice the present for the future. Well, what's the price you pay? You don't get the present. That's a big price, right? Because what you're doing essentially is you're taking all the potential suffering of the future and putting it into the present all the time. Well, so what happens? Well, maybe you live longer and you live healthier, but you're not without the burden that puts on you. There's very little difference between self-consciousness and shame. In fact, if you do psychometric analysis of the state of self-consciousness, it loads with neuroticism. So it loads with anxiety and emotional pain. So to become self-conscious, what does it mean to become self-conscious? It means you become aware. One way of thinking about it is you become aware of your vulnerability, or another is that you become aware of your insufficiency. Okay, so let's say that you're standing up in front of a crowd talking and you become self-conscious. What happens? Well, first of all, you can't talk anymore. The second is you kind of fall inside. The third is you feel ashamed. And the fourth is that you retreat and you look down. So it's a low status operation, and it's associated with heightened anxiety. And so then you might say, well, why would you become self-conscious before a crowd? Well, the answer is they can see you, right? And they can judge you, and you can make an error in front of them, and you can make a fool of yourself. So they put you down. You can display yourself in a manner that ratchets you down the dominance hierarchy. That's to become self-conscious. And so, well, at least you have the advantage of being covered up in front of the crowd. But let's say all of a sudden you're stripped of your clothes. So what's the problem with that? Well, all of your insufficiencies, let's say, are on painful display. You can be evaluated by everyone. But even more importantly than that, if possible, is that clothes actually protect the most vulnerable parts of you. Human beings are upright animals, right? We're very strange animals. You take a cat or a dog, they're basically armored. The part of them that you see, their back is heavily armored, heavily protected. Human beings stretched upright. And so the softest parts of us are there for display. Well, what would you want to be king? You could say king of the world or king of your own soul. What do you want to subordinate yourself to? How about your heroic willingness to encounter the unknown and articulate it and share that with people? There's no nobler vision than that. And I don't say that it's merely arbitrary. And it's not merely arbitrary too, because if you do that, to the degree that you do that, assuming your society isn't entirely corrupt, you will be successful. It will actually aid you practically. You'll rise up above men. You'll be selected by women. You'll be admirable. You'll be valued. And you know that because if you look at the people that you admire and value, again, unless you've taken a detour into dark places and are possessed with admiration for people who are working for malevolent purposes and for destruction, you just have to watch the people that you admire and try to figure out what's common across them and draw your own conclusions. And you can ask yourself too, when you're torturing yourself with your conscience because you're not doing what you should be and you know it, what is it that you're torturing yourself in relationship to? You have a vision of your own ideal, and you torment yourself if you're not matching it. What's the ideal? Well, you don't know, right? It's kind of incoherent and poorly articulated, but that doesn't mean it isn't trying to manifest itself and make itself known to you. Who's more self-conscious, women or men? And the answer to that is women are more self-conscious than men. And even further, you might say that women taught men to be self-conscious. And I believe that to be the case. Maybe babies taught women to be self-conscious, but women taught men to be self-conscious. And they still teach them that all the time. Because there's nothing that makes a man more self-conscious than to be rejected by a woman that he desires. So the woman is always offering self-consciousness to men, and it isn't necessarily a gift that they exactly appreciate. And that motif, of course, runs through the Adam and Eve story centrally, because Eve is damned forever in some sense for making Adam self-conscious. Well, he didn't want to be self-conscious. Things were pretty good when his eyes were closed and he was wandering around, not worrying about whether he was naked or not. Well, the women became self-conscious. Why? Because of snakes. Well, maybe, right? Maybe that's exactly what happened, you know? So imagine we're being preyed upon for millions of years by predatory reptiles, right? And we become more and more alert to threat and more alert to threat. And then one day we get so alert to threat that we can see threat lurking in the future. And then all of a sudden we become aware of the future, and then we become aware of death, and then we're really self-conscious. But it's pretty good if you want to keep the snakes down, which we've been doing quite successfully ever since then. But it's a big price to pay. We got so damn sensitive to threat that we were finally able to conceive the ultimate threat, not proximal threats, but the fact of threat itself, and the fact of mortality itself, and the fact of finitude itself. And maybe women learn that because they become painfully aware of the mortal limitations of their infants first, right? This small thing could die, could end, and certainly as an object of predation. And the problem again for men with being allied with women and infants is that it also heightens their self-consciousness, because you're a lot tougher and more indomitable, say, if there's just you. But as soon as you have a wife, say, and then you also have an infant, well, all the burden of their self-consciousness and their vulnerability is placed upon you. Well, it's a hell of a bargain. Well, why did men accept the bargain? Well, it's partly because women stood in front of them offering them fruit, right? Well, part of the price that the men paid for that was to wake the hell up. Well, who the hell wants that? It's a lot more calming to remain asleep with no knowledge of the sort of burden of mortality that you would bear if you became self-conscious. So fine. So now they're done with it. The snake and the fruit woke them up, and they can see, and the scales drop from their eyes. And so we can really see. Well, so what does that mean? Half our brain is devoted to visual processing. So as long as our eyes got better, our brain got bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. What happens when it gets big enough? Well, not only can you see, you can meta-see. You can start to see into the future. Well, that's exactly what happened to us. Not only could we see with our eyes, we could see with our imagination. And our imagination is you can see with your eyes closed, right? Close your eyes, bring up a vision, You can imagine the future. Well, what are you seeing? You're seeing a potential future with your eyes closed. The circuitry's there. Once it's developed, you can use it to imagine. You can project your vision into places that don't even exist, and you can start to conceptualize the future. What happens when you conceptualize the future? Well, I'm spoiling the punchline. You have to work because you can see the future coming. You think, the future's coming. It isn't just the present anymore. I don't have to just worry about whether or not I'm hungry right now. I'm going to have to worry about whether I'm hungry tomorrow and next week and next month and next year, and for me and for my wife and for my child and for the community. It's like you can forget about your day-to-day existence in paradise at that point. There's no evidence that people in industrialized societies are happier than people in non-industrialized societies. In fact, quite the contrary. We're less happy. Why? Well, because we fully and constantly bear the burden of the future. Well, that's good because we don't die and we live maybe 30 years longer and we have fewer horrible diseases and all of that, but that doesn't mean it's any picnic. You have to carry that along with you wherever you go. That's the burden of self-consciousness. Every social animal, and even many animals who aren't social, are embedded in a dominance hierarchy. The dominance hierarchy has a structure, or we couldn't call it a dominance hierarchy. Dominance hierarchy A, B, C, D, E, thousands of them across thousands of years. You extract out from all of them what's central to all of them. That's the pyramid of value. What question do you need answered about the pyramid of value? What's at the top? Because that's the ideal. That's the eye at the top of the pyramid, or the golden Buddha in the lotus. It's the same thing. It's the same thing as the crucifix, paradoxically enough. And it has to do with something like the voluntary acceptance and therefore transcendence of suffering. It's something like that. These are not arbitrary ideas. They're deeply, that's my case anyways, they're deeply, deeply, deeply rooted in biology and culture. They're as deeply rooted in biology as the dominance hierarchy is rooted in biology. And we already know the answer to that. The dominance hierarchy has been around for 350 million years. It's a long time. You don't get to just brush that off and say, well, morality is some sort of second order cognitive problem. It's like, no, it's not. I can tell you something about its instantiation in your nervous system. You have a counter at the bottom of your brain that keeps track of where you are in terms of your status, and it bloody well regulates the sensitivity of your emotions. So if you're at the bottom of the hierarchy, barely clinging on to the world, everything overwhelms you, and that's because you're damn near dead. And so everything should overwhelm you. You've got no extra resources. Any more threat, you're sunk. So you become extremely sensitive to negative emotion and maybe also impulsive, so that you grab while the grabbing is good. And if you're nearer the top in the dominance hierarchy and your counter tells you that, then your serotonin levels go up. You're less sensitive to negative emotion. You're less impulsive. You live longer. Like, everything works in your favor. Your immune system functions better, and you're oriented at least to some degree towards the medium and long-term future. And you can afford that because all hell isn't breaking loose around you all the time. And so then the question is there a way of being that increases the probability that you're going to move up dominance hierarchies? Well, that doesn't seem to be a particularly provocative proposition, unless you think that it's completely arbitrary and random, and that you can think that if you want, but I don't think there's any evidence for that whatsoever. I mean, we certainly have, even for sexual selection, we impose criteria. They're not random and arbitrary. This is the dominance hierarchy idea. Dominance hierarchies set themselves up as a matter of course. They're the standard way that animals organize themselves in a territory. Well, okay, human beings are watching those dominance hierarchies since we became self-aware, thinking, what the hell are we up to? What the hell are we up to? And there's a question that lurks in there. What constitutes acceptable power? What constitutes acceptable sovereignty? Who should lead? Who should rule? What should be at the top? Well, we talked about that. The Mesopotamians figured that out.
Premier vote review. What? Oh, we need to find a new place to live. Well, someone sounds like they're smoking pot. Better call the cops. Or maybe they have COVID. Equally good enough reason to, I don't know, call somebody about it. Wow. Fuck. Fucking over. Oh, bougie, whiny fucking baby. Oh, God. Mm. Fucking go to your gym and fucking pick up something COVID fucking like that English. Like what? Oh, fucking. I'm fucking toxic and weak. Your shitty fucking babies. Oh. No. What? What's the matter? Ken, did you give him the food? I'm assuming you have headphones on. Ah. Hmm.